Welcome everyone. This is Mr. Yeboah back at it again, and I am here to read for you. So in class today, you were given this reading. It is called The Case for Reparations, and it is written by Ta-Nehisi. This is part one of a longer essay which was published on the Atlantic a while ago, a couple years ago. And so I am going to be going through it. And I am going to be reading, and I'm going to be annotating. So I'm going to be annotating in response to this question, what connections can you see so far between Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay and Lorraine Hansberry's play? And I'm also going to be annotating in response to this prompt, which is to define 5 or more words / phrases from the reading. As you can probably see, this is not my first attempt at recording this video. I had to start over. So here is take number 2. And this is The Case for Reparations, like I said, by Ta-Nehisi Coates. The first section, so that's just one of my losses. And note, I might pause to sip some tea as I go about this reading. Okay, so that's just one of my losses. Clyde Ross was born in 1923, the 7th of 13 children near Clarksdale, Mississippi, the home of the blues. Ross's parents owned and farmed a 40-acre tract of land, flush with cows, hogs, and mules. Ross's mother would drive to Clarksdale to do her shopping in a horse and buggy, in which she invested all the pride one might place in a Cadillac. The family owned another horse with a red coat, which they gave to Clyde. The Ross family wanted for little, save that which all Black families in the Deep South then desperately desired: the protection of the law. All right, and over here is a picture of what I presume to be Clyde Ross. And yes, that is confirmed by this caption, which reads, Clyde Ross, photographed in November 2013 in his home in the North Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago, where he has lived for more than 50 years. When he first tried to get a legitimate mortgage, he was denied. Mortgages were effectively not available to Black people. So we're going to read more about that in the article. But I can make my first annotation here, which is that it seems that both Clyde Ross and Mama grew up in the South. And then I can also make my second annotation based on this second observation, which is in this caption, that Clyde Ross and Mama both live in Chicago. Cool. Continuing on to the second page. In the 1920s, Jim Crow Mississippi was, in all facets of society, a kleptocracy. The majority of the people in the state were perpetually robbed of the vote, a hijacking engineered through the trickery of the poll tax. So this is a tax for voting, and the muscle of the lynch mob. Between 1882 and 1968, more Black people were lynched in Mississippi than in any other state. You and I know what's the best way to keep the N-word from voting, blustered Theodore Bilbo, a Mississippi senator and a proud Klansman. You do it the night before the election. The state's regime partnered robbery of the franchise with robbery of the purse. Many of Mississippi's Black farmers lived in debt peonage, under the sway of cotton kings who were at once their landlords, their employers, and their primary merchants. Tools and necessities were advanced against the return on the crop, which was determined by the employer. When farmers were deemed to be in debt, and they often were, the negative balance was then carried over to the next season. A man or woman who protested this arrangement did so at the risk of grave injury or death. Refusing to work might mean arrests under vagrancy laws and forced labor under the state's penal system. Well into the 20th century, many Black people spoke of their flight from Mississippi in much the same manner as their renegade ancestors had. In her 2010 book, The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson tells the story of Eddie Irvin, a spinach picker who fled Mississippi in 1963 after being made to work at gunpoint. You didn't talk about it or tell nobody, Irvin said. You had to sneak away. Right, so I'm not noticing any really obvious connections to the play, but there are a bunch of words that I could define here. I'm just going to pick out a few. Kleptocracy is a good word to know the definition of. If you know the root word, if you've heard the word kleptomaniac before, it might look familiar to you. Someone who's a kleptomaniac, or it often gets called a klepto in our culture, steals. So kleptocracy has the root, which is government. So I'm going to be guessing that it's associated to a government that steals. And the actual definition is a government by those who seek chiefly status and personal gain at the expense of the government. So that might be one of the 5 or more words that I define. I know what the word perpetually means. It means reoccurring. I have a good definition of that. I know that a regime is just like the ruling government. I know franchise is the right to vote. I don't have a strong definition of peonage. I know that it has to do with like the feudal system, but I'm not sure exactly what it means, so I'm going to go ahead and look it up. Peonage is the use of laborers bound in servitude because of death. So I'm going to go ahead and define that word for myself. I've seen vagrancy signs before, like no loitering signs, no vagrancy. So I know that vagrancy is when you sort of don't have a home and so you move from place to place. So these were laws that were against people who were vagrants. I know that penal just has to do with the legal system. I know that renegade just means running away to their ancestors who fled from slavery. All right. So I have 2 of my words defined. I have an annotation on my first page, and I'm going to go ahead and continue to the 3rd page. When Clyde Ross was still a child, Mississippi authorities claimed his father owed $3,000 in back taxes. The elder Ross could not read. He did not have a lawyer. He did not know anyone at the local courthouse. He could not expect the police to be impartial, so he couldn't expect them to be unbiased, to not take on a side. Effectively, the Ross family had no way to contest the claim and no protection under the law. The authorities seized the land, they seized the buggy, they took the cows, hogs, and mules, and so for the upkeep of separate but equal, the entire Ross family was reduced to sharecropping. So that's an interesting sentence. So they're saying here, because the government wanted to upkeep the rule, which was separate but equal, they took the family, which was doing pretty well, and turned them into sharecroppers. And so I am going to look up sharecropping here because I have an idea of what it is from history class, but I would like an exact definition. So I'm just going to look up sharecropping. All right, Mayor and Webster, you can do this. All right. Sharecrop is to farm land or produce a crop as a sharecropper. That is not a great definition. Maybe if I just look at the word sharecropper, it might tell me more. A sharecropper is a tenant farmer, especially in the southern U.S., who is provided with credit for seed, tools, living quarters, and food, who works the land and who receives an agreed share of the value of the crop minus charges. So basically, you are given credit to get tools, living quarters, and food. So you start in debt, you owe your boss money, and then based on the amount of crops you produce, you can pay off that credit, and maybe after you pay off that credit, receive funds. So that doesn't sound like a great system for being able to be financially independent or financially free. I'm going to annotate the definition of sharecropping there. Boop. All right, computer, you got this. Or maybe you don't. I'm hoping you got this. Okay, cool. There's my definition of sharecropping. Continuing on to the next paragraph. This was hardly unusual. In 2001, the Associated Press published a 3-part investigation into the theft of Black-owned land stretching back to the antebellum period. So the period before, or no, the period after slavery. The series documented some 406 victims and 24,000 acres of land valued at tens of millions of dollars. The land was taken through means ranging from legal chicanery to terrorism. So chicanery is a really good word to know for the SAT. It just means trickery. So legal trickery to terrorism. Some of the land taken from Black families has become a country club in Virginia, the Associated Press reported, as well as oil fields in Mississippi and a baseball spring training facility in Florida. So this is all land stolen from Black families through the legal tax code that has become oil fields and baseball fields and country clubs. Clyde Ross was a smart child. His teachers thought he should attend a more challenging school. There was very little support for educating Black people in Mississippi, but Julius Rosenwald, a part owner of Sears Roebuck, had begun an ambitious effort to build schools for Black children throughout the South. Ross's teacher believed he should attend the local Rosenwald school. It was too far for Ross to walk and get back in time to work in the fields. Local white children had a school bus. Clyde Ross did not, and thus lost the chance to better his education. Then, when Ross was 10 years old, a group of white men demanded his only childhood possession, the horse with the red coat. "You can't have this horse. We want it," one of the white men said. They gave Ross's father $17. "I did everything for that horse," Ross told me. "Everything." And they took him, put him on the racetrack. I never did know what happened to him after that, but I know they didn't bring him back. So that's just one of my losses. All right, so I'm thinking of Mama here, and it seems like Clyde Ross did not necessarily have a chance to better his education. It also seems like Mama in the play didn't have a chance to go to school. So I might annotate here to similar to Mama in that he did not have a chance to pursue an education. And then I'm thinking about this act of just, having to give up his horse and just accepting the fact that, because he was a Black man in the South, he couldn't own a possession. And Mama seems to also have this idea that it's different in the South, that there's the way that Jim Crow and racism functions. She seems to have experienced that. So I'm not going to annotate for that. It's just a thought that I'm having in my head as I'm reading. All right, next paragraph. This picture appears to be sharecropper boys, though. So these are young children who would work the fields, helping out their family. Cool. The losses mounted. As sharecroppers, the Ross family saw their wages treated as the landlord's slush fund. All right, slush fund is a good word. I know it has to do with money. I don't have a good definition of it, so I'm also going to look it up. So let's hear from the homie Merriam-Webster. Hopefully she can tell me what a slush fund is. I'm getting the pinwheel of death. Hopefully it goes away. Here we go. Slush fund. A fund raised from the sale of refuse to obtain small luxuries or pleasures for a warship's crew. That doesn't seem like the right definition. A fund for bribing public officials or carrying on corruptive propaganda. An unregulated fund often used for illicit purposes. That seems like the right definition here. So an unregulated fund used for illegal purposes. So they would take their wages and use the wages of the sharecroppers and use them as part of their slush fund. We're gonna rewind. Landowners were supposed to split the profits from the cotton fields with sharecroppers, but bales would often disappear during the count, or the split might be altered on a whim. If cotton was selling for 50 cents a pound, the Ross family might get 15 cents, or only 5. One year, Ross's mother promised to buy him a $7 suit for a summer program at their church. She ordered the suit by mail, but that year, Ross's family was paid only 5 cents a pound for cotton. So that's like 10% of the value of cotton that year. The mailman arrived with the suit. The Rosses could not pay. The suit was sent back. Clyde Ross did not go to the church program. It was in these early years that Ross began to understand himself as an American. He did not live under the blind decree of justice, but under the heel of a regime that elevated armed robbery to a governing principle. Wow. He thought about fighting. Just be quiet, his father told him, because they'll come and kill us all. Clyde Ross grew. He was drafted into the Army. The draft officials offered him an exemption if he stayed home and worked. He preferred to take his chances with war. He was stationed in California. He found that he could go into stores without being bothered. He could walk the streets without being harassed. He could go into a restaurant and receive service. Ross was shipped off to Guam. He fought in World War II to save the world from tyranny. But when he returned to Clarksdale, he found that tyranny had followed him home. This was 1947, 8 years before Mississippi lynched Emmett Till and tossed his broken body into the Tallahatchie River. The Great Migration, a mass exodus of 6 million African Americans that spanned most of the 20th century, was now in its second wave. The Black Pilgrims did not journey north simply seeking better wages and work or bright lights and big adventures. They were fleeing the acquisitive warlords of the South. They were seeking the protections of the law. So I'm going to look up this word, acquisitive. I think it is also a good SAT word to know. Strongly desirous of acquiring and possessing. So these are warlords of the South who are very eager to take anything that they can. It seems particularly from these sharecropping families and from Black families. I might annotate here as well for the Great Migration. Like Mama moved to Chicago. I'm reading a little bit ahead here because I can see it at the top of the next paragraph. Clyde Ross was among them. He came to Chicago in 1947 and took a job as a taster at Campbell's Soup. He made a stable wage. He married. He had children. His paycheck was his own. No Klansmen stripped him of the vote. When he walked down the street, he did not have to move because a white man was walking past. He did not have to take off his hat or avert his gaze. His journey from peonage to full citizenship seemed near complete. Only one item was missing, a home, that final badge of entry into the sacred order of the American middle class of the Eisenhower years. So I might annotate here too, like the Youngers would like a home of his own. 1961, Ross and his wife bought a home in North Lawndale, a bustling community on Chicago's west side. North Lawndale had long been a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, but a handful of middle-class African Americans had lived there starting in the 40s. The community was anchored by the sprawling Sears Roebuck headquarters. North Lawndale's Jewish People's Institute actively encouraged Blacks to move into the neighborhood, seeking to make it a pilot community for interracial living. And the battle for integration then being fought around the country, North Lawndale seemed to offer promising terrain. But out in the tall grass, highwaymen, nefarious as any Clarksdale kleptocrat, were lying in wait. So that is quite a sentence. We know what the word kleptocrat means. it is a member of a corrupt government, a government that tries to take away and steal from its people. But highwaymen and nefarious might be unfamiliar to us. So I'm going to start with the word nefarious. It means flagrantly wicked or impious evil. And then we can assume that highwaymen are also flagrantly wicked. But if we want a specific definition, I'm pretty sure this is a term from the Middle Ages when people used to wait on highways, but not highways as we think of them, highways in terms of like pass from one town to another and rob people. Yeah, a thief who robs travelers on the road. So at this point, I probably have my 5 words, but I'm going to pause every now and again and annotate either way. All right, next paragraph. The key gist of that last sentence is that even up north, there were people looking to take advantage of Black families, just like Clyde Ross's, in a similar manner as the kleptocrats in the South had. 3 months after Clyde Ross moved into his house, the boiler blew out. This would normally be a homeowner's responsibility. If you own a home, then you fix whatever damages occur in the house. But in fact, Ross was not really a homeowner. His payments were made to the seller, not the bank, and Ross had not signed a normal mortgage. He bought on contract, a predatory agreement that combined all the responsibilities of home ownership with all the disadvantages of renting, while offering the benefits of neither. So that's interesting. I currently rent. That means that I have a landlord. If something goes wrong in my apartment,
it's 4 o'clock.
Now you know what time it is, but if something goes wrong in my apartment, I call my landlord and he's required to make those fixes for me because I don't own, he owns, and I rent from him. So I pay him each month to be able to live here. But Clyde Ross is in this weird middle place where he doesn't own his house because he bought it on contract. So if something goes and happens to his house, he has to fix it himself, but he also doesn't own the house because he's not a renter. He just owns a contract for the house, and we're going to learn more about that. Ross had bought his home or his house for $27,500. The seller, not the previous homeowner, but a new kind of middleman, had bought it for only $12,000 6 months before selling it to Ross. In a contract sale, the seller kept the deed until the contract was paid in full. And unlike with a normal mortgage, Ross would acquire no equity in the meantime. If he missed a single payment, he would immediately forfeit his $1,000 down payment, all his monthly payments, and the property itself. All right, so this is a really messed up system, right? This middleman buys the house from the previous homeowner for $12,000, then charges Clyde Ross more than double for the house. And Clyde Ross doesn't even own the home. He owns a contract for the home. And because it's just a contract, if he misses one payment, he loses the house. Typically, when you buy a house, you get it with a mortgage. That means that as you make more payments on the house, you gain more equity. So you have more of a stake in ownership. So if I've made 50% of my payments for the house, I own 50% of the house. If I sell the house, I get 50% of the profits from it. But Clyde Ross owns nothing. He builds no equity. And if he misses a single payment, he loses the house. So this is a really bad way to be in, a really terrible situation for Clyde Ross. And it sounds like it wasn't just Clyde Ross. We're going to learn more about that. The men who peddled contracts in North Lawndale would sell homes at inflated prices and then evict families who could not pay, taking their down payment and their monthly installments as profits. So this sentence is interesting to me because it says the men who peddled contracts in North Lawndale would sell homes at inflated prices. This is a brief moment in the play, but if you remember, when Mama is talking about her decision to move to Clybourne Park, she mentions that The reason that she's not moving to all Black neighborhoods is because the rents are too high. So I'm wondering if the reason, here's my question or my, inference, maybe the reason why the houses are too expensive in Black neighborhoods in A Raisin in the Sun is because of this scheme, this predatory system. I'm going to keep reading to find out more. So the men who peddled contracts in North Lawndale would sell homes at inflated prices and then evict families who could not pay, taking their down payment and their monthly installments as profit. Then they bring in another Black family, rinse and repeat. He told them he loads them up with payments they can't meet, an office secretary told the Chicago Daily News of her boss, the speculator Lou Fashini, in 1963. Then he takes the properties away from them. He sold some of the buildings 3 or 4 times. Wow. So if you can imagine, this one person buys a house for $12,000, sells it to a Black family for this amount, collects payments for them for years, and then they eventually can't afford one of the payments. They miss 1 month's rent. And then he takes the house back, and then he resells it to another family, does the same thing, and then they miss one of their payments, and then he does it again 3 to 4 times. This is a really terrible system. I mean, Lou Fashini is making a lot of money, but it's this really terrible thing for Black families who are just trying to buy a home. All right, next paragraph. Ross had tried to get a legitimate mortgage in another neighborhood, but was told by a loan officer that there was no financing available. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. The truth was that there was no financing for people like Clyde Ross. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Black people across the country were largely cut out of the legitimate home mortgage market through means both legal and extra-legal. Chicago's whites employed every measure from restrictive covenants to bombings to keep their neighborhoods segregated. So I'm going to look up this term, restrictive covenants. I know that the term extra-legal just means outside of the law, but I'm not necessarily familiar with restrictive covenants. It's a very specific legal term, so I'm going to look it up. All right, Merriam-Webster, tell me what restrictive covenants are. All right, it is a covenant acknowledged in a deed or lease that restricts the free use or occupancy of property. So it basically just restricts how property can be used. And it sounds like in this case, it's being used on the basis of race. So that's what I'm going to annotate for. So Chicago's whites employed every measure from restrictive covenants that restricted people of color to moving to their neighborhoods to bombings to keep their neighborhoods segregated. Their efforts were buttressed by the federal government. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration. So we've learned about the FHA already. The FHA ensured private mortgages, causing a drop in interest rates and a decline in the size of down payments required to buy a house. But an insured mortgage was not a possibility for Clyde Ross. The FHA had adopted a system of maps that rated neighborhoods according to their perceived stability. On maps, green areas rated A indicated in-demand neighborhoods that, as one appraiser, so these are the people who are appraising the neighborhoods, so as one appraiser put it, lacked a single foreigner or Negro. These neighborhoods were considered excellent prospects for insurance. Neighborhoods where Black people lived were rated D and were usually considered ineligible, so not allowed, for FHA backing. They were colored in red. Neither the percentage of Black people living there nor their social class mattered. Black people were viewed as a contagion, so like a disease. Redlining went beyond FHA-backed loans and spread to the entire mortgage industry, which was already rife with racism, excluding Black people from most legitimate means of attaining a mortgage. So the gist of this is that it was just very, very difficult for a Black family to attain a mortgage. I am going to look up this word rife because it is a good word to know. Let's see. It is prevalent, especially to an increasing degree. So that's one definition. I like this one better. Copiously supplied, abounding. So you might have heard the phrase rife with rumors, sort of like full of rumors. Here is a map of how Chicago was redlined. We can see these fully yellow neighborhoods, these green neighborhoods, and then these red neighborhoods, which we can assume were primarily neighborhoods that were Black or immigrant or full of people of color. And it says a 1939 homeowners loan corporation residential security map of Chicago shows discrimination against low-income and minority neighborhoods. The residents of the areas marked in red, representing hazardous real estate markets, were denied FHA-backed mortgages. And that's interesting, especially when we think about the Black Belt of Chicago. All right, next paragraph. A government offering such bounty to builders and lenders could have required compliance with a non-discrimination policy. So the US could have used a non-discrimination policy. Charles Abrahams, the urban studies expert who helped create the New York City Housing Authority, wrote in 1955. Instead, the FHA adopted a racial policy that could well have been culled from the Nuremberg laws. So I know that the Nuremberg laws are laws from Nazi Germany. I'm going to look up what this word "culled" means. Culled. It means selected or chosen from a group, so they could have been picked out from the Nuremberg laws. The devastating effects are cogently, that word cogently means powerfully, outlined by Melvin L. Oliver and Thomas M. Shapiro in their 1995 book, Black Wealth/White Wealth. Locked out of the greatest mass-based opportunity for wealth accumulation in American history, African Americans who desired and were able to afford home ownership found themselves consigned to central city communities where their investments were affected by the self-fulfilling prophecies of the FHA appraisers. Cut off from sources of new investment, their homes and communities deteriorated and lost value in comparison to those homes and communities that FHA appraisers deemed desirable. So this is what we learned about in the documentary. Basically, because Black families were sort of cut out of the housing market, their houses decreased in value over time because of these racist policies. And so they were consigned, given over to another's care, transferred or delivered into the hands of another. They were forced into basically central city communities. All right, next paragraph. In Chicago and across the country, whites looking to achieve the American dream could rely on a legitimate credit system backed by the government. Blacks were herded into the sights of unscrupulous lenders who took them for money and for sports. So unscrupulous means not making good decisions. This is anyone who, you know what, I'm just going to look up the word because I don't think I have a very clear definition of it. So unscrupulous. It's not scrupulous is the definition, which is not super useful. But scrupulous is sort of like being very, you know, maybe I can just use this example here. An unscrupulous businessman manipulated them into selling their land. Still not the most useful definition. You know what? I'm going to ask Google for a better definition. Unscrupulous. Sorry, Merriam-Webster, you failed me this time. Okay, having or showing no moral principle, not honest or fair. That is a great definition. So, lenders who have no moral principles. Okay. So in Chicago and across the country, whites looking to achieve the American dream could rely on a legitimate credit system backed by the government. Blacks were herded into the sights of unscrupulous lenders who took them for money and for sport. It was like people who like to go out and shoot lions in Africa. It was the same thrill, a housing attorney told the historian Beryl Sater in her 2009 book, Family Properties, the thrill of the chase and the kill. The kill was profitable. At the time of his death, Louis Ficini, so the guy who would resell houses over and over again to Black families, owned more than 600 properties, many of them in North Lawndale, and his estate was estimated to be worth $3 million. So this guy made $3 million plus dollars selling homes to Black families that he would later take back if they miss a single payment from reselling these bad contract loans to Black families. He made much of this money by exploiting the frustrated hopes of Black migrants like Clyde Ross. During this period, according to one estimate, 85% of all Black home buyers who bought in Chicago bought on contract. That is a ridiculous amount. 85% of people who own homes or who bought homes in Chicago were buying them on contract. That is terrible. If anybody who is well established in this business in Chicago doesn't earn $100,000 a year, a contract seller told the Saturday Evening Post in 1962, he is loafing. So this word is a good one to look up, but I think it just means not doing their job seriously, sort of relaxed. Not this definition of loaf, but this one, to spend time in idleness, so to spend time not doing anything. Okay. I believe we are getting to the last page. Contract sellers became rich. North Lawndale became a ghetto. Clyde Ross still lives there. He still owns his home. He is 91 and the emblems of survival are all around him. Awards for service in his community, pictures of his children in cap and gown. But when I asked him about his home in North Lawndale, I heard only anarchy. So anarchy means a lack of government. So wanting to go outside of the law in order to attain what he wants. And that would make sense based on how the law has treated him. We were ashamed. We did not want anyone to know that we were that ignorant, Ross told me. He was sitting at his dining room table. His glasses were as thick as his Clarksdale drawl. I'd come out of Mississippi where there was one mess and come up here and got in another mess. So how dumb am I? So how dumb am I? I didn't want anyone to know how dumb I was. When I found myself caught up in it, I said, how? I just left this mess. I just left no laws and no regard, and then I come here and get cheated wide open. I would probably want to do some harm to some people, if I had been violent like some of us. I thought, man, I got caught up in this stuff. I can't even take care of my kids. I didn't have enough for my kids. You could fall through the cracks easy fighting these white people and no law. So this idea here of getting caught up and not being able to take care of your kids, this is reminding me of Walter. All right, next paragraph, and I lied about this being the last page. I think we have one more after this. But Clyde Ross did. In 1968, he joined the newly formed Contract Buyers League, a collection of Black homeowners on Chicago's south and west sides, all of whom had been locked into the same system of predation. There was Howell Collins, whose contract called for him to pay $25,500 for a house that a speculator had bought for $14,500. There was Ruth Wells, who'd managed to pay out half her contract, expecting a mortgage, only to suddenly see an insurance bill materialize out of thin air, a requirement the seller had added without Wells' knowledge. Contract sellers use every tool at their disposal to pilfer, so that's steal from their clients. They scared white residents into selling low, so that's the blockbusting we learned about in the documentary. They lied about property's compliance with building codes, so whether or not the property was actually following the building codes, then left the buyer responsible when city inspectors arrived. They presented themselves as real estate brokers when in fact they were the owners. They guided their clients to lawyers who were in on the scheme. So this is all really shady business dealings. The Contract Buyers League fought back. Members who would eventually number more than 500 went out to the posh suburbs. So posh is usually stuck up, fancy, where the speculators lived, and embarrassed them by knocking on their neighbors' doors and informing them of the details of the contract lending trade. They refused to pay their installments, instead holding monthly payments in an escrow account. This is a finance term that I need a refresher on. Escrow. Come on, you can do it. I believe in you. You got this. Okay. A deed, bond, money, or a piece of property held in trust by a third party to be turned over to the guarantee upon fulfillment of a condition. So they were basically saying, until you give us a better deal on this house, until you give us an actual mortgage, we're not going to make any payments, and we're going to keep all the money we would pay you in a separate account. Okay. So instead, holding monthly payments into an escrow account. Then they brought a suit against the contract sellers, accusing them of buying property and reselling it in such a manner to reap from members of the Negro race large and unjust profits. In return for the reparations, so taking away, in return for taking away of their rights and privileges under the 13th and 14th Amendment. The League demanded prayers for relief, payback of all monies paid on contract and all monies paid for structural improvements of properties at 6% interest minus a fair non-discriminatory rental price for time of occupation. So they wanted to be paid back all the money that they had paid on the contracts, and they wanted interest on top of that because of this discrimination that they had faced. Moreover, the League asked the court to adjudge that the defendants had acted willfully and maliciously, and that malice is the gist of this action. So they had done things in a bad, sort of evil, unkind way. Ross and the Contract Buyers League were no longer appealing to the government simply for equality. They were no longer fleeing in hopes of a better deal elsewhere. They were charging society with a crime against their community. They wanted the crime publicly ruled as such. They wanted the crime's executors declared to be offensive to society. And they wanted restitution, so they wanted to be paid for the great injury brought upon them by said offenders. In 1968, Clyde Ross and the Contract Buyers League were no longer simply seeking the protection of the law. They were seeking reparations, so they were seeking to be paid for wrongdoing. And I lied about this being the last page, but I promise this is the real last page coming up. Oh no, that was the last page. I was not lying. Cool. They were seeking reparations. They were seeking to be paid for the harm that they had experienced. So that is the end of part 1 of this Ta-Nehisi Coates article. Thank you for listening to me read it. Hopefully you have your annotations and 5 vocab words to find. I definitely do. If you want to read more of this article, I will post the link on Google Classroom, but we will be discussing it in class shortly. Thank you for your time. Take a look. It's in a book, Reading Rainbow.